Well, if you know me very well, you know that I like to laugh, I like to joke, and since this Friday is April Fool's Day, I thought we might start with a little April Fool's humor. So, I heard about this guy who years ago swapped all the price labels at the gas station. Of course, now they're all electronic, couldn't do this. Back then, you could pull out those little numbers, right? So he swapped all of the prices on the pumps at the gas station. It was an April Fool's joke. Then I heard about an April Fool's joke played on a CEO of a large bank. The man almost fainted. He entered the office one morning, and all 12 of the ladies in the office all had maternity dresses on. And as he thought about how to replace them all during their maternity leaves, he was getting a little teetering there, like he's going to faint. Anyhow, they all hollered, "April Fools!" To the men listening, here's a word to the wise. April Fool's Day is not the best day to make a marriage proposal. Even if you're just kidding, right? Just note to self. Well, today as we continue our sermon series on this last week in the earthly life of Jesus, we come to Thursday, and we're going to discover a number of surprises that take place on this day. Now, I choose the word surprises, but a better word would be bombshells or gut punches. I'm sure after some of these surprises, the disciples wished Jesus would have said, "April Fools," but he didn't. It was Thursday, T-minus 1 day to the crucifixion. T-minus 3 days till the resurrection. So far in the series, we've seen how Jesus on that Sunday entered into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, and he was witnessed and met by songs of praise, and the Passover crowds cheered for him, right? On Monday, he came to Jerusalem, he cursed the fig tree, and then he cleansed the temple. On Tuesday, he spent the day teaching, right? Giving many lessons, answering many questions, trying to get through to those calloused hearts. And then last week, we explored what happened on Wednesday. We discovered an example of an extravagant giver and a ruthless taker. So fasten your seatbelts this morning, because we're going to move fast. We've got a lot of ground to cover. That Thursday, in the last week of Jesus' earthly life, was the first day of the Jewish feast called the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. At some point on that Thursday, Jesus' disciples asked him that he wanted them to make preparations so that they could celebrate the Passover feast with him. So Mark records what took place with these words. On the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go? Prepare the Passover so that you may eat it." So he sent 2 of his disciples and told them, "Go into the city. A man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Wherever he enters, tell the owner of the house, 'The teacher says, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make the preparations for us there." So the disciples went out, entered the city, and found it just as he had told them. And they prepared the Passover. So we noticed Jesus had made some kind of previous arrangements for the Passover, just like he had made some previous arrangements probably for that donkey that he rode on Sunday. Mark and Luke point out that the man carrying the jar of water would meet them, and that they would then follow him wherever he went, and then they would ask the owner of the house, and he would show them that upper room. Now, Luke tells us that the disciples who were sent on this mission were Peter and John. And that's found in Luke 22:7. Now, many scholars believe this home where the Passover was going to take place, with the upper room, was the family home of John Mark, the one who would be a traveling companion of Paul and Barnabas, and the one who would author the Gospel of Mark. So Mark continues in verse 17 of that chapter, chapter 14. When evening came, evening of Thursday, he arrived with the 12. Matthew and Luke point out that Jesus reclined at the table with his apostles. So they're there to participate in the Passover meal that the Jews have been observing since they left Egypt, the time of the Exodus, the first Passover. We're talking about 1,500 years of observance at the time of Jesus. So Jesus and his disciples gathered around the table according to the cultural practice of the day. Now, the most famous painting of the Last Supper was done by Leonardo da Vinci, 1495. In many respects, he did not do us any favors with his rendition of that event, right? Da Vinci showed they were all on one side of the table, Jesus in the middle. He depicted the scene with the raised table and chairs. Now, I know this was good for a painting, right? To get everybody in it and see their faces and all, but this is not the way it took place. The traditional Jewish table was about 15 to 18 inches tall, more like our coffee table, not like our tables that are 28 to 30 inches tall. And as we've said before, the people would be on cushions on the floor, reclining on an elbow. Now, notice this diagram. This shows the traditional seating around a Passover table. The host of the dinner would occupy that second position on the left as you go around the table, right? And the youngest person present would occupy the position first, to the right of the host, because they played an important part in the ceremony. They would ask the questions that would prompt the answers as they would retell the story of God. The chief guest would be seated on the host's left. And then after the chief guest would be all the other guests around the table, from the most important to the least. The least important person would be all the way around the table at the other end, opposite the youngest. So Jesus was the host, and John was the youngest of the apostles. So he was on Jesus' right. And the biblical record shows that Judas was seated in the chief position, and that Peter was across the table, probably in the least position, the lowest position. So perhaps Judas was the only one presumptuous enough to take the chief position. Luke tells us that during the meal, a dispute arose among them as to who was the greatest. Maybe they were arguing about who gets to sit where around the table. Jesus said, whoever is greatest among you should become like the youngest, and whoever leads like the one serving. For who is greater, the one at the table or the one serving? Isn't it the one at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves. And then John tells us that Jesus then gave this surprise demonstration of that very truth. John writes, now when it was time for the supper, the devil had already put into the heart of Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, to betray him. And Jesus knew that the Father had given everything to his hands, that he had come from God, that he was going back to God. So he got up from the supper and laid aside his outer clothing and took a towel, tied it around himself. And next he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, dry them with the towel tied around him. So as you know, washing the feet was a customary thing in that time, right? The host would have a servant who would wash the feet of the guests. Now, this was for hygiene's sake, for sure, right? But it was also a means of showing hospitality and honor. But the task was always performed by a servant, never by the master of the house. So it was shocking that Jesus, their teacher, their master, their Messiah, is the one playing the role of the servant. To kind of give you an illustration for comparison, imagine you're invited to the White House to dinner, or maybe to your favorite celebrity's house. Now, you're already shocked because you got an invitation, right? But then you show up at the house, the White House or the celebrity's house, and they open the door, and there they've got a cooking apron on. The president with a cooking apron, or the celebrity, and they welcome you into the house, they seat you in the living room, and next thing you know, they come with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, and the president is serving you, or your favorite celebrity. You're shocked, right? You're humbled. You're uncomfortable being served by someone so famous, so important. And perhaps that's how they felt, uncomfortable, as Jesus washed their feet. And perhaps that's why Peter did what he did, right? So when it became his turn, Jesus comes to Peter, and what does Peter say? You will never wash my feet. Jesus says, okay. I don't have to wash your feet, but then you have no part of me. Well, the idea of not being a part of Jesus was worse to Peter than having him wash his feet. So he goes to the opposite extreme, right? Well, then wash my whole body. And Jesus says, that's not necessary, Peter. But he washed his feet. He washed all the disciples' feet. Excuse me. He even washed Judas's feet, right? Knowing Judas had already made the deal with the enemy. Wow. As you know, when Jesus finished washing their feet, he got back to the table and he taught them a beautiful lesson about how they should follow his example and lovingly serve each other. And all men would know they're his disciples because of their love for each other, right? But washing their feet wasn't the only surprising thing Jesus did at the meal. He surprised them then when he suddenly announced the scripture had to be fulfilled that said, the one who eats my bread has raised his heel against me. He was telling them about what would happen before it happened so that they would believe that he is who he is when it happened, right? And then Jesus became troubled in his spirit and said, truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me. Imagine sitting there. They were shocked. You picture them looking around the table. They can't imagine that any of them, it's hard for us to understand, right? They can't imagine that anyone, even Judas. Judas didn't immediately come to mind. Oh yeah, we know who it is. It's him. They're shocked. And so Peter motions to John across the table like, ask him, right? And so John does. He leans over to Jesus and says, who is it, Lord? And Jesus says, it's the one I give a piece of bread to after I've dipped it. And then Jesus dipped the bread and handed it to Judas. And John reports that after Judas ate the bread, Satan entered him. And Jesus told him, what you are doing, do quickly. And Judas left immediately. The other apostles didn't understand what it meant, right? But can you imagine how unsettling this was? This announcement and the sudden departure of Judas. What's going on? April Fools, right? You're kidding, aren't you? After Judas left, Jesus proceeded with the rest of the Passover meal. And during the traditional Passover meal, there were several times during the meal where the bread would be broken. Something would be said, and then another cup would be given. Something would be said. There are 4 cups during the traditional Jewish Passover. Most scholars believe that it's at the breaking of the bread and the taking of the 3rd cup is when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. When he took the bread that time and said, this is my body. And he took the cup and said, this is my blood, right? So we know so well, because we do it every week, the bread represented his body, the fruit of the vine, his blood, and his body and blood would be given on the cross in a matter of hours. But they didn't grasp it. The Passover celebration concluded with the 4th and final cup, after which some or all of Psalms 115 through 118 were sung. And it's neat because Matthew and Mark both tell us after they sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. That's how the Passover meal ended, with song, right? Now, it appears that as they made their way out of the city and across the Kidron Valley and up the Mount of Olives, Jesus taught them along the way. John gives us 3 chapters after the Lord's Supper and the washing of the feet. 3 chapters of teaching. John 14 and 15 and 16, packed with powerful stuff. And then John gives us a prayer in John 17. Beautiful prayer where Jesus prays for himself and he prays for the disciples and he prays for all of us who believe through their testimony. And then chapter 18, they actually get to the garden. So all that takes place between leaving the upper room and getting over to the Mount of Olives. But at some point in that journey to the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus made another surprising statement. Tonight, all of you will fall away because of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. Again, Jesus, are you kidding? Is this April Fool's? No. And like always, the overconfident, impetuous Peter spoke up, well, even if these other guys, desert you, I won't. Not me. And then Jesus replies, I tell you tonight, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And then Peter countered with even stronger words. Even if I have to die for you, I will never deny you. Of course, all the other disciples said the same thing. Oh, we won't either, Jesus. In Luke's account, Jesus said, Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And you, when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Oh, you're going to fall away. But when you turn back, strengthen your brothers. So you talk about gut punches, right? You talk about bombshells. Judas betray Jesus. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. All of us desert Jesus. Are you kidding? Then they arrived at the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. And so to the east of Jerusalem, across the Kidron Valley, lay that Mount of Olives, which had been a favorite place for Jesus whenever he was there and around the city, right? It took about 30 minutes for them to go from where they were in the city, in that upper room, across to the Mount of Olives. And it was on this mount earlier in the week that Jesus had told the disciples about the destruction of Jerusalem. So picture them sitting there looking at Jerusalem as he says, not a single one of these stones will be left on another. And it's on this same mountain some 40 days later, after the resurrection and all the appearances, that Jesus will ascend to heaven from that mountain. Now as midnight drew near, Jesus came here with 11 of the apostles, minus Judas, right, to wait for the arrival of Judas, along with that mob who would arrest him. Now while they'd been in that upper room, and while they'd been making their way there, Jesus had been preparing them for this night's drama. The cross was only 9 hours away. And Satan would have his moment of victory. And Jesus knew how difficult this would be for them. And so he told them, Judas is going to betray me. And Peter's going to deny me. And all of them will desert him. But they couldn't imagine any of those things happening. Now the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is a picture of it, is a private garden filled with olive trees, and some of them are very, very old that are there today, right? Maybe going all the way back to the time of Jesus, right? Now, the garden at the time was owned probably by some merchant who had an olive oil business. He may have been a disciple, or he may have been just sympathetic towards Jesus. Today, there are 4 sites who compete for the distinction of the Garden of Gethsemane, but they're all virtually in the same area, so we know about where the garden was. Anybody here been in the garden on the Mount of Olives? All right. See at least a couple of hands going up. That'd be a beautiful thing to see, right? But from this vantage point, About halfway up the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane had a clear view across the Kidron Valley to the city of Jerusalem. And it would be impossible for anyone to leave that city, travel across the Kidron Valley, up towards the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane without being seen, especially at night, carrying torches, which is what Judas and the mob were going to be doing, right? And so there in the garden, Jesus chose to wait for the inevitable. And he turned to his Father in prayer. And Luke tells us, when they arrived in the garden, Jesus told the disciples, "Pray that you may not fall into temptation." And then he withdrew from them a stone's throw, and knelt down and began to pray. Now Mark's version includes more details. They came to the place called Gethsemane. He told his disciples, "Sit here while I pray," and took Peter, James, and John with him. And he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and stay with me." And he went a little farther. He fell to the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will." And so 8 of the apostles stayed in one place, while Jesus took Peter and John and James with him a little further away to another place. And Jesus reveals his heart to them. And he gave them more instructions. And they had never seen their powerful leader in such a vulnerable state, grieved to the point of death. And here we see the human side of Jesus on display. We see it also in one of his statements from the cross that we'll see, Lord willing, next week. Scripture tells us Jesus was tempted in every way just as we are, yet was without sin. Hebrews 4:15. And it was not Jesus being God that sustained him through the agony of that evening and the next day, but it was his confidence and trust in God. And so here in the garden, only hours before his death, Jesus gave us the perfect example of how to turn to God, to receive a supply which is lacking in our own strength and abilities. Jesus asked his Father to take this cup away, if it was possible. But he wanted God's will to be done. So this cup he's referring to is his death on the cross. May this cup pass. May I not have to drink it. It's obvious Jesus didn't want to go to the cross. And yet he did for at least 2 reasons. One reason is because it was God's will. And for Jesus, that would probably be enough. And yet there was a second reason as well. He had told his disciples in that teaching section between the upper room and the Garden of Gethsemane, "Greater love has no man than to lay down his life for his friends." Love is what ultimately took him to the cross. His love for us. Twice we're told that Jesus came back to where Peter, James, and John were supposed to be keeping watch with him in prayer, and he found them sleeping. Mark reports there in chapter 14 and verse 37, then he came and found them sleeping. He said, "Peter, Simon, why are you sleeping? Couldn't you stay awake 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you won't enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." And once again he went away and he prayed, saying the same thing. And again he came and found them sleeping because they couldn't keep their eyes open. And they didn't know what to say to him. How do you apologize, right? Sorry. Now, I'm sure Jesus really wasn't surprised that they were sleeping. And yet it must have hurt nonetheless, right? The lateness of the hour, it's after midnight, combined with 4 cups of wine, it's taken its toll on them. But Luke is the only gospel writer who mentions that an angel from heaven appeared to Jesus, strengthened him. How cool is that? Wouldn't you have liked to caught a vision of that? And Peter opened his eyes like, oh, wow. Luke also tells us Jesus prayed so fervently with such great anguish that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. And Mark continues. Then he came a third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Enough! The time has come. See, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up! Let's go. My betrayer is near. And while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, suddenly arrived. With him was a mob with swords and clubs from the chief priests and scribes and the elders. His betrayer had given them a signal. The one I kiss, he's the one. Arrest him and take him away under guard. So when he came, immediately he went up to Jesus and said, Rabbi, and kissed him. And they took hold of him and arrested him. One of those who stood by drew his sword, struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his ear. Now, all four Gospels tell the story of Peter pulling out his sword and taking a swing at that high priest's servant, right? I'm sure he was going for the neck, right? Thankfully, all he got was the ear. He's identified as Malchus, the high priest's servant. And it's no mistake that the Bible names him by name. I'm sure people in that first century went and asked him about it, right? Luke the doctor tells us that Jesus said, no more of this. And touching his ear, he healed him. Luke 22:51. If Malchus hadn't been a believer in Jesus before that moment, I'm guessing he became a believer at that moment, right? Wow. Jesus told Peter to put his sword away. Those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. And then he said, if I wanted to, I could call on my Father, and he would send 12 legions of angels. I don't need you to protect me. How would the Scriptures be fulfilled if we resist this moment? The Gospel of John includes an interesting interplay prior to Peter taking out his sword. And it reads this in John 18:3. So Judas took the company of soldiers, some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. And Jesus, knowing everything was about to happen, went out and said to them, who is it that you're seeking? Jesus of Nazareth, they answered. I am he told them. Judas, who betrayed him, was also standing there. And when Jesus told them, I am he, they stepped back and fell to the ground. And he asked them again, who is it that you're seeking? Jesus of Nazareth, they said. I told you, I am he. So if you're looking for me, let these men go. And this was to fulfill the words he had said, I have not lost one of those you have given me. Isn't this an interesting moment, right? When Jesus said, who do you want? He wasn't seeking information. He knew who they wanted. He was establishing whom they were going to get. Jesus' power over those soldiers was like the power of Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Star Wars films. You remember that moment when Obi-Wan Kenobi said to those stormtroopers, these are not the drones you're looking for. Remember that? These are not the drones you're looking for. Jesus, just by the power of identification, I am, causes them to fall back and down on the ground. The power of the identity of Jesus. And so he establishes with them, I'm the one you're going to get, and you will be letting these men go. Who's really in charge here? right? So having established who was in control, Jesus established the ground rules under which he would go with them. I will go with you, and you will let these men go. Now let me mention one more thing about the betrayal. How ruthless was the kiss of the betrayer, right? I mean, is Jesus not a celebrity at this point? Doesn't everybody really know what Jesus looked like? Probably. And yet there's so many other ways Judas could have identified which one was Jesus. But how ruthless to choose such an intimate of gestures, a kiss, to mark the one condemned. But Jesus knew it was coming. And so he said, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? He gets it right out there. Do you understand what you're doing? Are you taking responsibility for this? Now, Mark concluded the garden story with these words. And then they all deserted him and ran away. Now, a certain young man, wearing nothing but a linen cloth, was following him. They caught hold of him, and he left the linen cloth behind and ran away naked. So Jesus was left alone with his captors. All the disciples fled, just as he said they would. Now, Mark is the only gospel writer who mentioned this young man who ran away naked. And many people think the young man had to be Mark, the gospel writer. Now, it's theorized that when Judas and his mob were searching for Jesus that night, maybe the first place they went was to the upper room, thinking Jesus might still be there. I mean, Judas left and they were still there, right? And so maybe they went there first, and if it was Mark's house, maybe Mark then, when he said, he's not here, ran to the garden knowing where Jesus was and beat them there. Who knows, right? But after maybe checking out the upper room, then Judas said, well, I know where he must be. He's got to be out in the garden where he always goes to. So when the soldiers tried to apprehend him, they grabbed him by the linen cloth that he had wrapped around as kind of some makeshift shorts, right? And he slipped out of them. So next time you're playing Bible trivia, you know the answer to the question, who was the streaker in the Bible? Mark. Now, I wish we had more time to discuss the eternal lessons that we can learn from Thursday. Here are 4. First of all, let's take to heart the fact that Jesus is the one who serves, and that we are served by the best. And whenever we partake of the Lord's Supper like we do every Sunday morning, let's remember that we're invited to sit at God's table. And Jesus is the host. He's not the guest. He's the one who serves, not the one served. And when the bread is broken, it's Christ who breaks it. And when the wine is poured, it's Christ who pours it. And when we are washed of our uncleanliness, it's because He put on the apron. And remember, this is just a warm-up for what is going to happen in heaven when we sit at God's table there. Secondly, let's take to heart that Jesus prayed for us on that night before He was crucified. And that He sits at the right hand of God and is interceding for us today. Romans 8:34. And so Jesus prayed for Peter when Satan wanted to sift him like wheat. And He prayed for those disciples. And He prayed for all of us who would later believe. He is our eternal high priest in the heavens who lives to intercede for us. He's our mediator. Number 3, let's take to heart. Jesus understands how it feels to be betrayed. Judas betrayed Jesus with a kiss. All the disciples abandoned Jesus. Peter denied knowing Him 3 times. The religious leaders hated Him. The crowds turned against Him. Jesus understands when you and I are betrayed by someone who may even be close to us. Loving people is messy. And life isn't fair. Jesus never promised us that it would be. And so Jesus didn't look for fairness on earth. He kept his eyes on God's future justice. And while he was going through a literal hell on earth, he kept his eyes on heaven. And let's keep in mind that even when all the earth turns against us, heaven turns toward us. And then finally, let's take to heart the fact that Jesus was ultimately the one who was in control. Satan and Judas and the mob of religious leaders and soldiers, they weren't the ones in control. Jesus had predicted all that was going to happen that Thursday, all that was going to happen on Friday, but he also knew what was coming on Sunday. And it looked like Satan had won. It looked like evil had won, but God and good always win. And so it may look like Satan's having his way in your life or mine, but remember, Sunday's coming. God's in control, and God's plan cannot be stopped. These are some of the eternal truths we can take to the bank. We can hold on to. I'm not kidding. This is no April Fool's joke, folks. This is real stuff that we can hold on to and live by, and we'll be rewarded for it.